Hello lovely people, my name is Emma and today we're going to be doing a bit of an author in the spotlight for the glorious Mary Roach. Now if you are a fan of pop science, you've been around the block for a little bit, you will know her name. She was an absolute powerhouse of science writing, and today I wanted to talk about all of her books because I've read all of her back catalogue, unless she snuck a book out recently that I haven't spotted in the bookstore, unlikely, and also kind of talk about why I like her writing style and then to sort of vaguely rank her books in order. So for me, Mary Roach's writing style, she has a wonderful lightness to her that really means that it's very easy to sort of read her work. They're very, very approachable. I'd consider it some of the sort of easiest reading science that is out there. The way her books work is she picks a topic, for example, whether it be the paranormal, sex, humans at war, dead bodies, and then what she does is she, each chapter is focused on a slightly different aspect of this kind of topic, and she approaches it very much from a layman's perspective. As far as I'm aware, she has very little or no scientific training in any formal way, and she goes and she interviews and talks to various experts and finds out about it. So this is why I really like her writing style. I think they're a wonderful sort of sweep through a different topic, and it means that if you're getting bored of any particular area, you're not going to be spending very long on it. It does feel a little bit like a buffet table of different ways of approaching the same idea. So which ones of hers do I like and which ones don't I? Which ones are worth reading? Spoiler alert, I love them all. I think they're all totally worth a read, but we are going to rank them a little bit to talk about which ones I think are worth reading first, or which ones I preferred personally. So let's jump into them. The first three are kind of interchangeable with how much I enjoyed them, but we do have to rank them in some vague way. So these are comfortably my top three from her. The first one is Grunt. I nearly said by Mary Roach. Of course it's by Mary Roach. That's what we're doing here. This is the curious science of humans at war, and it's specifically looking at how we keep human beings alive in war zones rather than funky new ways to kill human beings in war zones, which I am far more down for the first one than the second one. I would not have enjoyed this book this much if it was just about weapons of mass destruction. So this is kind of standout moments from this book for me, where there was a really great chapter on submarines and submarine rescue, and things get really gnarly there because there's all sorts of crazy pressure problems when you're that far down under the sea, and that was really, really interesting. It was sort of the first thing I'd read about that has since sparked me going on to like read other books, listen to podcasts. Pressure is wild, what it does to the human body. It's so cool. It also talks a lot about kind of the ways that we would test various armoured vehicles. We actually use corpses to crash test armoured vehicles, and the way that they change as sort of technology progresses, the way that where you get damaged changes, which then means that we kind of need to change what kind of reconstructive surgery we're doing. It's a whole conversation about reconstructing like people's feet because of sort of like shock waves through them. There's a whole section about various, mainly men who have kind of suffered injuries below the belt, shall we say, and how sort of the medical community is working to help rehabilitate these men and make sure they still have kind of some semblance of a sex life. Generally incredibly interesting. There's a whole chapter about sharks, very cool, and about like shark pheromones and how there was a concern in one of the world wars that like sinking ships would just be munched on by sharks and like any survivors would just immediately become chow. So there was a whole thing about like, are there anti-shark pheromones that we can put on the uniform or like give them in bottles or whatever to try and save them from sharks? Very cool, very Jaws. Fantastic book, and it was the first one of hers that I read and really cemented that she was an interesting author to me. Then we go for probably her biggest, most popular one, and that is Stiff, and this is about the various ways that we use dead bodies. So it does talk about organ transplants in various different fun ways, but there's also conversations about, again, like I said in Grunt, using corpses as crash test dummies in a whole range of different ways. It talks about using cadavers when it comes to being able to practice medical procedures and things like that. Generally, it's incredibly cool. It's obviously incredibly ghoulish, but for me, that's really where Mary Roach is at her best. I think she really works very well in this sort of areas of taboo and sort of dealing with things that are generally actually quite gross and icky when you think about them. And for me, she really has a lot of toilet humour that helps to like lighten the mood, and it does feel a little bit sort of like a a toddler slightly in your ear being like, hee, they mentioned something gross. And I really appreciate that element of it because it definitely lightens everything. And one that I think really encapsulated that toilet humour perfectly, and is Mary Roach at her finest when it comes to her humorous asides, is Packing for Mars, The Curious Science of Life in the Void. This is looking at how we keep human beings alive in space, and I know what you're thinking, like, ooh, space travel, NASA, that's gonna be really cool. And it's actually more just the science behind how you put like 6 people in a tin can and then fire them up somewhere where they can't leave, and how you deal with things like bodily waste and smells and fluids and stuff that is going to go incredibly gross in zero gravity. And this one was my favourite from that side of things. So much of it was so disgusting, and it was perfect in equal measure. Like, I bloody loved this book. Mary Roach also does this really fun thing where she puts little asides in footnotes, and I love me a silly little footnote that's basically just the author making a joke that would break the flow of the writing if it was in the main bit, but you're happy to just read as a little side and be like, hee, that's funny. So like, I really appreciate this book. I think this one is fantastic. Now we come into her ones where I'm like, I still had a good time, but they're not my favourites. And please, don't for a second think that any of these weren't good reads, because like I say, like, Mary Roach is like pizza. Even when pizza is bad, it's good, but sometimes they're really great pizzas and sometimes they're just fine. And so for me, one of hers that was like just fine is Spook, Science Tackles the Afterlife. And I think my problem with this one is just that there's less rigorous science in it than the others, because it's about the paranormal, so of course it's going to be less rigorous science. It was very cool. It probably had the most history of all of them. It talks a lot about like the seances that were incredibly popular in the Victorian era, and sort of the various people who attended them. I think there's a bit on Arthur Conan Doyle in here, who was so big into seances it was ridiculous. And sort of the various different scams that people would do, where they were trying to convince people that like ghosts had appeared, and it kind of talks about ectoplasm and what that could be, and like recipes for ectoplasm. So I really enjoyed that side of things, but for me it just wasn't as quite like intensely sciencey, and I'm really here for her like gross biology stuff, frankly. There was a woman who tried to hide a rabbit up her vagina. That is in this book. That's fun. Then the next one I want to talk about is Gulp, and this one is about the stomach slash the sort of digestive tract as a whole, and we do go all the way through. And this one was good fun, but again, just not quite as interesting as some of the others. Maybe I like creepy things as well. Maybe I just, if there isn't like a couple of dead bodies in it, I'm less into it, because that really is a recurring theme of Grunt and Stiff. But yeah, very interesting. Standout chapter for me had a very interesting one about Elvis, and Elvis's sort of battles with stomach problems and megacolon, which is where you suffer from like intense constipation to a point where it basically like stretches your colon beyond what is sort of reasonable to get a snap back, and how that probably was the root of what killed him. And yeah, it has a whole bunch of stuff. I think it also has a chapter on like scientists eating stupid stuff, which I did know a bit about before because I'd read, it's Alex Boese's other one other than Elephants on Acid. I will link it down below. It's like Electrified Sheep or something, and that is a book about weird stuff that scientists have done to themselves. And scientists, especially sort of in ye olden times, the history of science, scientists are very happy to swallow stuff that will probably kill them, to see if it will kill them, and then hope that they've got time to write it down to turn it into science before they die. And there were some chapters on that, and that was quite interesting. Then we have Boink, which is The Curious Coupling of Sex and Science. This one probably should be ranked higher, but the reason why it's so low down here is until I flicked through the book, I couldn't remember a single thing this book talked about. For me, that is a little bit of a red flag about how much I enjoyed it. Like, there are standout chapters, as you may have noticed in my reviews here, where I can tell you what really the book was about. And I feel like Grunt especially was one that is very sharp in my brain. Whereas Boink is one where I'm like, I know I've read it, can't really remember much about what happened in it. When I flicked through it, things started to come back to me, and I was like, oh yeah, that was quite an interesting read. There's a whole conversation about sort of women's clitorises in relation to their vagina, and whether that means how likely is it that a vaginal orgasm is actually possible, or is it just that their clitoris is close enough to their vagina that they can feel it that way, and how that correlates to height. Apparently, if you're a shorter woman, you're more likely to have a vaginal orgasm. Who knew? There's also, weirdly, a chapter about pig orgasms, so that was strange, but I did learn a lot. There's a whole thing about vibrators, the history of the vibrator, the history of Viagra and sort of what they did before we had Viagra. There's some good stuff in here. It's still very interesting, fun, Mary Roach at her finest. I just couldn't remember any of it, and I feel amiss ranking it higher if it wasn't memorable enough to stick in my brain. All the pig orgasms just wiped my mind, like one of those like Men in Black flash things, and my brain went, no, not retaining that, goodbye. So who knows. And then the final one that for me really was her at her weakest is Fuzz, or Animal Mineral Criminal. I think it's got 2 different names. I kind of prefer the title Fuzz. I think we should call it Fuzz. And this is a look at animals and their interactions with human law. It was fun, it was interesting, but it's not her doing her like sciencey biology thing. And I think in a similar way to Spook, there just wasn't enough of that side of stuff. Like for me, Mary Roach is going to pick something gross, and maybe she's just run out of gross stuff. But I really sort of come to her for weird, fun, quirky experiments I didn't know about, sort of fun ways that the human body works, things like that. Whereas for me, Fuzz just felt like a different book. It almost doesn't count as a pop science book. I think it's almost like a pop sociology book. It did look at things like, you know, bears and how you have to have specific things on your windows to be able to stop bears breaking in, and idiot tourists like to move to lovely, or like rich people like to move to areas where there's high bear populations and then ignore the local laws about what you need to have in your house, and then bears are in their house and they're like, oh my god, it's a bear, I'm gonna die. And then all the different ways that like people have to deal with that, the local law enforcement. I think there's a section on moose as well. Canada seemed to feature quite heavily, and yeah, generally it was fun. I had a good time, but for me it's not a Mary Roach book almost, so it almost fits in its own little category. But if you're looking at like animals and humans and their interactions, quite fun. So yeah, so that's it from me. These are the Mary Roach books I've read, which is all of them. This is what I recommend, which is basically any of them that take your fancy. I think as a general rule of thumb, her writing style is consistent across the board. She is consistently hilarious. They're consistently light reads. They're a great intro into non-fiction if you're not too sure what to read in non-fiction. Everything is just bubbly and fun. It doesn't get bogged down too much with too many like stats and things like that. You're gonna breeze through these books, and they are the kind of thing that provide you with so many fun little factoids where you can be that person at the dinner party going, did you know? And then something horrifying about the human body and corpses and what we do with them. And who doesn't want to be that person in life? That is what we should all aspire to be. So have a wonderful reading week. Do let me know down below what Mary Roach books you've read, and I'll chat to you soon. Bye.